Look closely at the photos from the Potsdam Conference. You see three men smiling, but look closer. One smile is fake. In July 1945, Winston Churchill arrived in the ruins of Berlin, not as a conqueror, but as a gambler who was about to lose his last chip. He looked at the man sitting across from him, Harry Truman, and saw a joke. A provincial nobody, a haberdasher who bought his suits off the rack and didn't know the difference between the Balkans and the Baltics. Churchill was certain this little man was weak, and weakness in the face of Joseph Stalin was a death sentence. Churchill had a plan, a secret, dangerous plan. He intended to wrap Truman in a web of flattery, terrify him with stories of the Red Army, and use American blood and money to save the crumbling British Empire. He treated the president like a naive nephew who needed a wise uncle to guide his hand. He poured him brandy, quoted Shakespeare, and played the role of the global strategist. But Churchill made the most fatal mistake of his long life. He didn't look at Truman's eyes. If he had, he would have seen something that terrified even Stalin. He would have seen the cold, flat stare of a man who didn't care about history, tradition, or friendship. Truman wasn't a nephew. He was an executioner. And he had already decided that for America to rise, the British Empire had to die. The trap was set, but it wasn't for Truman. It was for Churchill. To understand why Churchill lost, you have to understand the game they were playing. Churchill was playing chess. He was thinking 3 moves ahead, obsessed with the balance of power in Europe. Truman, he was playing poker, and he had an ace in his pocket that burned a hole through his jacket: the atomic bomb. When the secret telegram arrived whispering that the Trinity test was a success, Churchill was ecstatic. He practically danced. He saw the bomb as the salvation of the English-speaking peoples, a joint sword that he and Truman would wield together against the Russian bear. He urged Truman to be aggressive. "Stand up to him," he whispered in Truman's ear, pointing at Stalin. He thought he was sharing the cockpit of the apocalypse. He was wrong. Truman listened to Churchill's ranting with a polite, frozen smile. He didn't share the British Prime Minister's enthusiasm for a crusade. Why? Because Truman knew something Churchill didn't. The bomb wasn't a joint asset. It was American property, exclusively. Truman realized in that moment that he didn't need Churchill. He didn't need the British Army. He didn't need allies at all. With this weapon, the United States was no longer a partner. It was a god. Truman quietly decided to cut Churchill out of the loop completely. He would drop the bomb on his own terms, on his own timeline. He let Churchill believe he was a player, right up until the moment the Enola Gay took off. It was a brutal betrayal, executed with a handshake. While the mushroom clouds were still rising over Japan, Truman prepared his second strike. This one wasn't nuclear, but it was just as devastating. And its target wasn't Hirohito or Stalin. It was Churchill. The war had bankrupted Britain. The only thing keeping the island from starvation was American Lend-Lease aid. Billions of dollars in food, oil, and machinery flowed across the Atlantic. Churchill assumed this would continue. After all, Britain had fought alone for 2 years. America owed them. It was a debt of blood. Truman didn't believe in debts of blood. He looked at the spreadsheets and saw a competitor that needed to be put down. In August 1945, Truman signed a document that shocked the world. He canceled Lend-Lease, instantly, without warning. It was a financial guillotine. Ships loaded with meat and wheat that were already halfway to Liverpool were ordered to turn around and come back to New York. Britain was cast into the dark. Churchill, now out of office, but still the voice of the nation, was horrified. He wrote to Truman, begging, pleading, invoking the spirit of their special relationship. Truman's reply was cold silence. He forced the British to come to Washington on their knees, begging for a loan to survive the winter. And the price of that loan? The dismantling of the British Empire's trade monopoly. Truman forced Britain to sell off its assets and open its markets to American corporations. He didn't just defeat an enemy, he liquidated a friend. Churchill realized too late the Americans hadn't come to save the empire. They had come to foreclose on it. Broken, humiliated, and voted out of office, Churchill had one weapon left: his voice. In 1946, he saw a chance for redemption. He wanted to force America into a permanent alliance against Russia. He accepted an invitation to speak at a tiny college in Fulton, Missouri. Truman invited him. Truman traveled with him on the train, laughing, drinking whiskey, playing poker. He lulled the old lion into feeling safe. Churchill thought, "This is it. I will make the speech of my life. I will define the new world." He delivered the Iron Curtain speech. It was a masterpiece of rhetoric. It was a declaration of war against the Soviet Union. Churchill sat down, expecting Truman to stand up, shake his hand, and pledge America's might to the cause. He expected a united front. Instead, he got silence. The American public panicked. They didn't want another war. They called Churchill a warmonger. Stalin went berserk. And Truman? The man who had read the speech on the train? The man who had nodded in agreement? He pretended he had nothing to do with it. He distanced himself. He let Churchill take all the heat, all the criticism, all the hatred. Truman used Churchill as a test balloon. He wanted to see if the American people were ready to hate Russia. When he saw they weren't, he threw Churchill to the wolves. It was a masterclass in political cynicism. Churchill was left standing alone on the stage, a relic of the past, while Truman watched from the shadows, taking notes on what not to do. The humiliation didn't end in Europe. It extended to the sands of the Middle East. For decades, Britain had ruled Palestine. It was a strategic jewel, the gateway to India and oil. Churchill, a Zionist at heart but an imperialist by profession, believed that London, and only London, should decide the fate of the Holy Land. He expected Truman to stay out of it. After all, what did a farmer from Missouri know about the intricate blood feuds of Arabs and Jews? But Truman didn't care about strategy. He cared about votes. Facing a losing election in 1948, he needed the support of the Jewish community in key states. While British soldiers were being shot in the streets of Jerusalem, trying to keep the peace, Truman began issuing orders from the White House that undercut them. He demanded the immediate entry of 100,000 refugees, ignoring British warnings of civil war. Churchill watched from London, furious. He saw the empire unraveling. But the final insult came on May 14, 1948. As the British lowered the Union Jack in Haifa and sailed away in defeat, Israel declared independence. 11 minutes later, 11 minutes, Truman recognized the new state. He didn't consult the British. He didn't even tell his own Secretary of State. It was a slap in the face to London so loud it echoed around the world. Truman showed that he would sacrifice his closest ally's prestige for a domestic political win. Churchill realized then that the special relationship was a lie. America had no friends, only interests. There is a heartbreaking story from the end of Truman's presidency. Churchill, back in power, but old and frail, visited Washington once last. He sat on the presidential yacht, staring at the Potomac River, talking about the past. He talked about the great summits, the wars, the glory. He tried to charm Truman once last, trying to prove that Britain still mattered, that their wisdom was still needed to guide the young American superpower. Truman poured him a drink, smiled, and checked his watch. He didn't need Churchill's wisdom. He had the CIA. He had the H-bomb. He had a booming economy built on the ruins of the European empires he had helped dismantle. Truman listened to the old lion roar, but he knew the lion had no teeth. The Americans were now running the world, and they were doing it without asking for permission from London. Churchill bet that the bond of language and history would save his country's status. He lost. Truman bet that ruthless economic pressure and military dominance would make America the only master of the West. He won. As Churchill sailed home, leaving behind a Washington that no longer needed him, the reality set in. The 20th century didn't belong to the poets or the warriors. It belonged to the cold, calculating men like Harry Truman. The giant had been slain by the ghost, and the ghost was now the only king left standing. But the final act of submission was not economic or diplomatic. It was military. Churchill had always dreamed of a European army, led by British generals, standing shoulder to shoulder with America. He envisioned a partnership of equals. Truman, however, had a different vision. He wanted an alliance, yes, but one where America commanded and everyone else obeyed. He birthed NATO.
On the surface, NATO looked like the great alliance Churchill had preached about. But look at the fine print. Who commanded it? An American supreme commander. Who controlled the nuclear trigger? The American president. Who decided when to go to war? Washington. Truman designed NATO not to protect Europe, but to control it. He turned the proud armies of Britain and France into auxiliary units of the American military machine. Churchill tried to fight it. He argued for a British naval command in the Atlantic. He argued for independence in nuclear strategy. Truman crushed him. He told the British bluntly, "We pay the bills, we give the orders." Churchill was forced to accept a subordinate role for the Royal Navy, the navy that had ruled the waves for centuries. It was the ultimate degradation. The Grand Alliance was just a polite name for an American protectorate. Churchill had bet on a marriage. Truman had signed a custody agreement. There was one secret that Truman kept from Churchill that hurt more than any policy decision. It was about betrayal within Britain itself. By the late 1940s, American intelligence, specifically the Venona Project, had discovered that British intelligence was riddled with Soviet spies. The famous Cambridge Five were leaking everything to Moscow. Kim Philby, a man Churchill trusted, was a traitor. Truman knew. He knew the British secrets were unsafe. Did he warn his old friend, Churchill? Did he help them clean house? No. He simply cut them off. He stopped sharing critical nuclear secrets with London, citing security concerns, but never fully explaining why. He let the British intelligence services rot from within, watching them chase their tails, while he consolidated American intelligence power in the CIA. When the truth finally came out years later, it was devastating for British prestige. But the fact that Truman knew and said nothing was the real knife in the back. He treated Britain not as a compromised ally that needed help, but as a liability to be quarantined. He let Churchill believe his services were world-class, while knowing they were an open book to Stalin. It was the behavior of a cold manager firing an incompetent employee, not a brother in arms. The final test of wills came in 1950. North Korea invaded the South. Truman reacted instantly, sending American troops to fight. He demanded that his allies join the fight. Churchill, though in opposition, supported the war, thinking this was the moment to revive the partnership. Britain sent soldiers. They fought bravely. They died alongside Americans. But Churchill expected reciprocity. He expected that since British boys were dying for an American cause in Asia, America would support British interests in Iran and Egypt. It was a classic imperial trade-off. We help you in Korea. You help us keep our oil in the Middle East. It was the ultimate asymmetry. You bleed for us, but you bleed alone. Churchill's bet that blood shed on the battlefield would bind the nations together was proven wrong one last time. When Winston Churchill finally died in 1965, the world mourned the end of an era. Kings, queens, and presidents gathered in London. But Truman didn't go. He was old, yes, but his absence was symbolic. He stayed in Independence, Missouri, sitting on his porch, reading history books. He respected Churchill, perhaps even admired him, but he had never viewed him as an equal. Truman knew something the rest of the world was just figuring out. He knew that he was the one who had really won the 20th century. Churchill had saved the West from Hitler, but Truman had organized the West under American rule. He had taken the bankrupt, battered pieces of the British Empire and forged them into the American sphere of influence. He had done it without sentiment, without grand speeches, often with a smile and a handshake. Churchill bet on the past, on the enduring power of the English-speaking peoples. Truman bet on the future, on the raw power of the American dollar and the atom bomb. And in the cold light of history, the score is clear. The lion roared, he scratched, he fought, but the haberdasher walked away with the keys to the world. Churchill's tragedy wasn't that he lost the empire. It was that he lost it to his best friend.